lecture leaves me, if I'm happy or sad, and what I'm looking forward to. Maybe we should repeat this symposium in 2-3 years and see if we have some new things to say and where we are going at. I would like to ask now Dr. Fishman to join us. In this symposium, we look at multidisciplinary things and also multidisciplinary faculties. We had some senior staff. We have a young lecturer with us from public policy. He's doing very unique work with developmental countries, and I really appreciate the fact that you came back because most of the time he's around all over. And besides the fact that it gives me the opportunity to see you, it gives us the opportunity to hear about what's going on with food security around the world. And Dr. Fishman, please join us.
Thank you, Tammie. I'm very honored to join this panel. And I'd like to share with you a few thoughts about the connection between poverty and food security and agriculture. And I just want to basically touch on 3 big questions for which I won't have any answers but are relevant to this. And one is basically, to what degree is the transformation of smallholder agriculture, the agriculture that is practiced by hundreds of millions of small-scale farmers in developing countries, to what degree is the modernization of that agriculture an effective poverty eradication strategy? What will it take to achieve that in an environmentally sustainable way? And what is the role of Israel? What does Israel have to contribute to this global challenge? So basically, the World Development Report in 2008 made a stand that, according to that report, agriculture is a very fundamental instrument for poverty reduction. Basically, there are a lot of the world's poor are rural farmers, and therefore improving their productivity is a key to increasing their income. So the logic basically for this approach is quite simple. The first part is just about income. Again, most of the world, 3/4 of the global poor, the extreme poor, are rural farmers, and they depend on agriculture as their main source of income. So in this map, of course, you see that the dark colors represent larger fraction of the labor force employed in agriculture, and we see that in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, we see very high rates of people employed in agriculture. So obviously, increasing their incomes will, increasing their productivity will increase their income. Another aspect of that is more about the poor, not just as producers of food, but as consumers of food. If you look at the global map of the yields, how much cereals are produced per hectare in different parts of the world, you see a similar pattern. All these maps will look the same. Here, the light colors indicate low yields. Okay, the lighter colors that you see in sub-Saharan Africa indicate yields that are less than 2 tons per hectare of cereals, rice, maize, wheat. And again, in South Asia too, you see very big gaps in agricultural productivity around the world. And not only, and closing these yield gaps, we know that these yield gaps are not just a result of geographical differences of agroclimatic conditions, they are a result of poverty itself. So these low yields in the developing world are both one of a cause and an outcome of poverty. And closing these yield gaps between developing and developed countries will not only help increase the incomes of the poor, but it will also help the world substantially to meet the need to double food production in the next 3-4 decades. So we have a global food challenge, and the smallholder farmers of the world have a very important role to play in that. If they can converge to the yields achieved in industrialized countries, that will go a long way towards solving the global food challenge. It will help stabilize global food prices, and we know that, of course, from a consumption point of view, that will serve not only the poor who produce the food, but the poor who consume the food. Because a larger share of their consumption is actually based on food. And as was mentioned earlier, part of the original thinking about the poverty lines is that this ability to provide for a minimum diet. Then a third aspect of it is nutrition. And that's related again to the poor as consumers of food. There is this idea that by improving the diversity, quality, and quantity of the food that the poor produce, you can also improve the nutritional quality of their diets. And that is very important because we know we have a great deal of evidence that shows that exposure to stress in very early stages of life has lifelong consequences for welfare, for health, physical and cognitive health, and for economic productivity. So poor nutrition at early stages of life, there's a great deal of evidence that that translates later on to low welfare, low economic productivity. For example, we know that people who were born during times of economic stress, during times of famines and droughts, as adults are less healthy and less productive. And so in this way, nutritional deficiencies may be creating an intergenerational mechanism transmitting poverty from one generation to another. And the idea again here is by any successful advance in the diversity and the quality of what the poor consume will translate into better outcomes as adults as well. So these are like three basic reasons for why development policy is naturally should be focused on agricultural production. There is also another point about how our growth in agriculture can spill over. There's a very rich and long tradition in macroeconomics discussing those spillovers. I'm not going to dare to say anything about that point in front of this audience, but I'll just go back to the other 3 points and mention that even though this logic seems very sound, it's actually not completely straightforward, and there is some debate about the merits of this approach. One of the doubts revolves around whether, despite the fact that achieving those goals can go a long way towards eradicating poverty, there are doubts on whether a focus on smallholder poverty can actually be effective in that way. Smallholder farmers face a host of challenges to advance their productivity. There's a paper that came out of Oxford a couple of years ago which created a steer, really trying to really question this merit of focusing and trying to promote the agriculture of smallholders who cultivate an acre or a hectare, very, very small-scale farming, really asking, is this really wise given what we know? Is it going to be possible to achieve that kind of modernization in that sector? There's another doubt about whether really increasing the productivity of poor farmers really does translate into better diets and better nutrition. This is an active area of debate and research. We don't have a lot of evidence on that, but there are evidence that sometimes it doesn't work. For example, in India, there is a disconnect between increasing productivity, even in agriculture, and the quality of the diets that is consumed by the poor. And so these are questions, open questions. There's active area of research. One thing we can do is look historically at what happened during the Green Revolution. Obviously, at the country level, there is a great deal of, there's a strong correlation between advances in agriculture. So here, this is just tracking on the continental level, tracking over time what has happened in the last 4 or 5 decades. So on the x-axis, you have here how much cereals is produced in a particular country per hectare, so the agricultural yield. On the vertical axis, you have the infant mortality, a very powerful and painful aspect of extreme poverty. And we see that as agriculture advances over time, and that's the Green Revolution that started in the 60s in East Asia and South Asia. So South Asia is there in blue. Latin America is there. South Asia is in lighter blue. You see their yields have gone up to a great degree, and infant mortality has also fallen sharply. Sub-Saharan Africa in red, you see much less advances in agriculture. There wasn't really a green the green revolution really didn't make it to sub-Saharan Africa, and there also the gains in infant mortality are not as large. There's not that much we can learn in terms of causal mechanisms from these kind of correlations. One thing that I'm working on with some colleagues is trying to look at what the microeconomic evidence for that might be. So what we're doing here is we're actually collecting a very large amount of data, household data. By looking at, there are surveys that are run every year for a long time in many countries around the world called demographic and health surveys. And when we aggregate this data together over the last 3-4 decades, we have data on 600,000 children that were born in all of these places you see in the colored dots all over the world. We're trying to see, and we're also combining that with very spatially explicit sub-country data on the adoption of modern seeds. That was a big part of the Green Revolution, to see how strong is this correlation at the household level between adoption of modern seeds and declines in infant mortality. And we're subjecting it to very demanding regression, and we are finding a very robust relationship. Indeed, at the household level, the adoption of improved seeds has led to decreases in infant mortality. So this is some input into the first two big doubts, but there's another third important doubt about whether we can replicate these successes at the present time, and that has to do with the environmental basis of the Green Revolution. We know now that just replicating and extending the Green Revolution as it has been practiced in the last 3-4 decades to the remaining parts of the world where yields are still very low is just not going to work. The Green Revolution was based on using more environmental inputs to produce more grain. But at this point, we're out of land. We're basically out of water. Agriculture is a major source of pollution. So the next modernization of agriculture has to be based on a much more efficient and sustainable use of natural resources. And again, that is something that is not clear can be done effectively at the scale of smallholder agriculture. And the key to all these questions really is technology, and the barrier is not technological, but it's socioeconomic. The technologies that can achieve all of these three goals, increasing productivity, diversifying it, and doing it sustainably, those technologies already exist. And the problem is that the rate of adoption of these technologies in developing countries with smallholder farmers still remains very low. Here you see two farmers in Gujarat in India. One of them is still using a very traditional method of irrigation to flood his field on the right. On the left you see a farmer that has adapted drip irrigation, a technology that enables you to produce more food with much less water. And despite the fact that this is a very water-scarce part of India, the majority of farmers here belong to the category on the right. Only a small number actually use this technology. So understanding the barriers to this technology is really the key to being able to achieve all of these goals. And by the way, here's a technology which is obviously an Israeli technology. Drip irrigation is the poster child of Israeli innovation in agriculture. There are many such technologies in Israel. Many of them have the potential to really transform smallholder agriculture in the developing world. But the potential of these technologies has still not really been tapped. The way agriculture developed and grew in Israel is now more relevant than ever before, probably, to the developing world, because the developing world is dealing with a harsher environment, drier, less water, a changing climate. And so the Israeli technologies are really more relevant than ever before, but unfortunately, the potential is not being tapped, even though Israel, especially in early years, had a tradition of technical assistance in agriculture to developing countries. Those efforts have kind of gone down over time. The budget dedicated to this kind of technical assistance has gone down over time, unfortunately, and there hasn't been enough research in academia, there hasn't been enough research into the socioeconomic aspects of this challenge. Most of it has been focused on the agronomic side of it. And so right now we have a very good understanding here of plants, but we don't have such a good understanding of the people who grow them. And that's where we feel some of the gap lies, and this is what we're trying to do here now, So we're trying to basically we have a lab here which is trying to work on these issues and understand how Israeli technologies can be better applied. Now, there are many challenges, of course, many economic challenges. One of them is small scale, the small scale of farmers. We have projects going on in multiple parts of Africa and South Asia and India. And it's interesting in this map, again, to see Israel is right at the heart of the area. I think Israel must be of all developed countries, I would venture to say Israel is probably geographically closest and most proximate to most of these countries we're talking about. And so it's easy for us to go to these areas. And many of our projects are really trying to understand what are the barriers and especially to understand whether new approaches whether there are new approaches, new mechanisms, new models that can enable smallholder farmers to adapt these kind of challenges. Let me just quickly mention two examples. Both of them are focused on drip irrigation again. So, for example, in Senegal, we are working with the Israeli government and the Italian and Senegalese government to try to see whether an approach that is based on groups can help increase the use and adoption of drip irrigation and improve nutrition. So we're doing a very careful field experiment, a large field experiment, to be able to evaluate the merits of this approach. The approach is based on the idea that the small scale of every poor farmer is too small to really be able to effectively apply a technology like drip irrigation. But by aggregating them in groups, maybe one way to create this kind of scale and therefore make the use of drip irrigation more cost effective. So this can work in terms of economies of scale, but it will introduce other social challenges, such as the ability of groups to work together, to maintain the systems, to avoid free riding. And we hope that this field experiment will allow us to gain some answers into how effective this approach is and how to make it more effective. Another example in India, also a very dry area, suffering from very extreme drought in the last 10 years. Where the government of India is attempting a very, very innovative and ambitious attempt to disseminate drip irrigation on a very large scale. So this project, called Ramtal project, basically tries to take 10,000 farmers who do not use any irrigation. They grow one cereal a year, have very low yields, completely dependent on rain, subsistence farmers, and basically overnight turn them into profitable modern farming who use drip irrigation to grow fruits and vegetables. It's a very ambitious and very large scale. It's the biggest drip irrigation project in history in the developing world. And we are working there with the local implementers to really evaluate whether it's working or not, and so on. There's a few other projects. I won't get into them. I just wish us good luck with these projects, and I'll end here a little bit early.